All right, welcome everyone to this week's meeting of the Clyde Sukeforth chapter of SABR. I am Bruce McClure, the chapter chair, and we always hold our meetings in conjunction with the Gardner Waterman chapter of SABR in Vermont, Dr. Clayton Truder, chair. Now, what was it like to be a Black player and playing in Spartanburg, South Carolina in 1965, or Memphis, Tennessee in 1973? What was it like to play for the white coaches and scouting directors from the Jim Crow South who cut their professional teeth in the segregated game before Jackie Robinson ushered in the sports integration? Or to be called into the clubhouse with your Black teammates one spring training morning in 1969 and told that to make the ball club, you'd have to beat out the Black men in that room because none of you were ever going to beat out a white player regardless? Or to spend a staggering 8 seasons playing single A ball in the Midwest League, even winning the Triple Crown, while watching less talented white teammates get promoted each year while you stayed behind. The 13 players in under Jackie's shadow are going to tell you. Fellow SABR member Mitch Nathanson is a professor of law at the Villanova University School of Law and a professor in the Jeffrey S. Morad Center for the Study of Sports Law there. He has written numerous articles examining the interplay between baseball and American culture and won the 2006 McFarland SABR Award presented in recognition of the best historical or biographical baseball article of that year for his work entitled The Irrelevance of Baseball's Antitrust Exemption, a Historical Review. His new book, Under Jackie's Shadow, Voices of Black Minor Leaguers Baseball Left Behind, uncovers, in their own words, the histories of the African-American men who played minor league ball in the post-Jackie Robinson era of the 60s and 70s, and he is here tonight to discuss that book with us. Mitch Nathanson, welcome to Northern New England. How are you?
I'm doing good, thanks. You know, just as you said that, my dog came out full of vim and vigor. So hopefully he won't bark, but we'll see.
That's all right. We don't mind at all. Go ahead. The floor is yours, my friend.
Oh, well, thanks. And thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about the book, a couple things about it. And then I think it's always best if, we do like an interaction, a Q&A, if people have those. So yeah, anytime, I'll try to talk for maybe 20 minutes or so, and then any questions or comments or anything, we can do that, because that's always the best part, I think. But anyway, so I'll talk a little bit about how the book came to be and some of the challenges of the book, and some of the players, and then we'll open it up. But first of all, I just want to say that, like, when I started working on this, people told me that this is like this is a difficult topic to do, and it is a difficult topic to do for many reasons. But the main reason is, and Bruce and I were talking about this beforehand, was that by definition, there are no famous people involved in this story. There's a person who's a cousin of a famous person, and there's people who are, have connections, a brother of a famous person, but these people aren't famous. They're not even close to famous. And when people were telling me, like, wow, that's a hard sell, I kind of heard, but I kind of didn't. And now I see it, and it just really brings home to me how difficult it is for these stories to get out, because unlike a group like this, and that's why SABR, SABR is a different group. There's people who really are invested and really care, but outside of that, most people mainly care about famous people. And if you can frame a story around a famous person, people might be interested. But if you can't, and if the story is, well, these are people who didn't get famous, and let me explain perhaps a reason why, that's a different thing. And it sort of perpetuates the problem, I think, because if you only hear the stories of the people who make it, it sort of separates the problem from the person. And when that happens, you sort of distance yourself from it. So with all that being said, I guess I'll talk a little bit about the story, how I got to know all this. And this actually affected me as well, because when I was working on the Dick Allen biography that I did, again, a famous person, I through circuitous ways ended up getting in contact, or one of the people in the Dick Allen book got in contact with me, and he was a minor leaguer in the Philly system, uh, who um, who had read the book or had known of it, and had mentioned to me that, yeah, the stories of Dick Allen and Ernie Banks and Willie Mays and Hank Aaron and all those players, and they had horrible experiences in the minor leagues and even after they got to the major leagues. He says, but those experiences don't translate to the rest of us who never made it. And he's like, there's many more people like him than there were of Dick Allen or Hank Aaron. He says those people are, not to diminish anything that they went through, but he's like, well, that's a totally different story. That isn't the same story. It's their story has an upbeat ending. The stories of the people I know, he was saying to me, don't have that ending. And so he very badly wanted to tell me his story. And my reaction to him, I guess, was very similar to the reaction many people have to any of these stories, which is like, okay, well, what do you do with it? Because I never heard of you. And what do I do? But, eventually I said, sure, fine. So let's talk. And we talked, and he had a very compelling story. And I decided that, wow, this is really a great story in terms of its resonance. And this is a story people should know, but who's going to know it? Who's ever going to know this story? And so I sort of felt at that point like I had somewhat of a responsibility, since he told me his story, that I thought that, well, I should try to do what I could to help him get his story out there. Because it was very important to him. And that was another thing that I sensed when I talked to him. And then when I spoke to other players as well, and I'll get to them in a second, but I really got the sense that it was important to them that somebody hear their story. And so I felt, well, there's not much I can do in this world, but I can do that I can do. And so I decided that's what I would try to do, and that's under Jackie's shadow. And so that player, I'll talk a little about him first. That was Mickey Bowers. And I always hesitate to say that you never heard of Mickey Bowers, because in a group like this, I bet you somebody's heard of Mickey Bowers. And so I won't say that here, but he's not a player that many people are familiar with. And I only came across him in the course of doing the Dick Allen biography, when I went to research the Carpenter papers in the Hagley Library in Wilmington, because Bob Carpenter owned the Phillies back when Dick Allen was there. And I was looking to see if there was what was in the Carpenter papers about Dick Allen. And I went down there and I found a couple of things. First thing I found was that the Carpenter papers have been scrubbed clean of anything related to Dick Allen. There is nothing Dick Allen. There's nothing on Dick Allen in the Carpenter papers. Obviously, somebody went through it and redacted a lot of stuff. You can get Mike Schmidt's social security number, by the way, but you can't get anything about Dick Allen in those papers. Yeah, all those reports have their social security numbers on. There's a little card. They have a file when they were minor leaguers, and they have all their pertinent information, including their social security numbers. So there you go, if you're interested. But they didn't have anything for Dick Allen. Anything for Dick Allen was gone. So I couldn't find any Dick Allen stuff per se, but I went through the files, and I was just looking for the name Dick Allen, Richie Allen, anything like that. And I did come across a few things. And one of the things I came through was a report, which I'll share my screen in a second. I'll show you it because I made a copy of it, which is it's the year-end report that this player, Mickey Bowers, manager, filled out and sent to Dallas Green, who was the farm director for the Phillies at the time. This is in 1970. And so Mickey Bowers played in A-ball for Spartanburg. I believe it was Spartanburg. And so Dick Allen's name is mentioned in the report. And so that's that's where I heard of him. And I mentioned Mickey Bowers in the Dick Allen book really briefly based upon the thing that I'm going to show you in a second. And then that's eventually resulted in him reaching out to me. But anyway, I'll show you the report. Let me find it here if I can find it. There it is. So there it is. So this is the little report that the you can all see that? Yeah. Okay. So this is the report that the minor league managers send to the home office. You can see the basic stuff, the speed and all that stuff. And then they have baseball attitude, drags himself around, doesn't hustle all the time. Individual ball player hangs head when he goes hitless, whether he wins or lose. If we lose, he has a good day. He's happy. He has a tendency to pop off. He's an individual type fellow. Let me see if I can close this for a second. Hold on. There. He's an individual type fellow. When someone crosses him, he doesn't hold back. Will fight for his rights. Remember, this is 1970. He has told me he doesn't like whites pushing him around or telling him what to do. Had one fight on the ball club for this reason. Okay, if white is in authority, like a manager. Then we have at the end, this is this was for Paul Owens. This boy must be held in check and learn to take orders. I've written him a personal letter telling him very bluntly what we expect. This is where I saw the Richie Allen. Richie Allen, his attitude and conduct is his idol. I'm not going to condone putting this organization through another such era with this young player. So there's the report. And the thing with that report is, there's some baseball stuff on there, but there's also a lot of other stuff that, he likes Richie Allen, and we think he's going to be another Richie Allen. By the way, the Phillies should be so lucky to have another Richie Allen. It was clearly a damning report, and damning in a very racist way. And that's what I put in the book. And then I became a little more interested in Mickey Bowers, and I learned that he led the team in 1970 in Casey, come on. He led the team in 1970 in Casey in hits and doubles and home runs, stolen bases, and they didn't promote him after the season, and eventually they released him. So you have a guy who's leading the team in everything, and it doesn't get promoted, and then he gets released. You got to wonder what's going on. So anyway, so that was Mickey Bowers, and he, by the way, did not know that this report was out there until I showed it to him. He never knew why he got released. I went through the report with him. I sent him the report, and then we talked about it. And he went through all the different things in the report, and he explained the fight he had. That was when one of his teammates yelled something racial at him as he was rounding the bases, and he called them out on this, and the guy took a swing at him, and he swung back. And a bunch of other things that were in this report. And as I said, he didn't know that this report was out there, but he did know that things didn't go well for him after that season. And so anyway, so he told me his story and what happened to him afterwards. And I just thought it was really, really poignant. And I thought, wow, I wish I had known that. But I first thought I wish I had known that for the Dick Allen book. But I never even thought to reach out to Mickey Bowers, quite frankly. For the same reason everybody else, kind of dusts off non-famous people. Well, he's not famous. Why would I talk to him? Right. And so now that I'm talking to him, I'm like, wow, he's got a really compelling story. And I asked him, are there other people that who have compelling stories like this, who you think might talk to me? And he said, sure. And he gave me a couple of names, and then I reached out to those people, and some of those people some of those people were receptive and some of them weren't. And I can understand why they wouldn't be. I mean, this is somebody they don't know. A half a century after the fact, reaching out to them to talk about something which, quite frankly, it's very painful for a lot of these guys. And a lot of them just don't want to revisit it. And that's certainly understandable. And also, by the way, it's their story and not mine. So if they don't want to tell their story, then they don't want to tell their story, and that's the end of it. But there were players who did, and the 13 that I ended up with are 13 stories of people who thought it was important that they communicate their story, and so that's what I did. And so the idea was to try to convey through in the stories on the page what I heard when I was listening to them, when I was talking to them, and try to convey to whoever would read the book sort of what it felt like to sit there and hear it. That's essentially that's what oral history is. But I found that it's easier said than done, because when you try to say, if you just transcribe what somebody says, people start talking and then stop mid-sentence, or they'll break away to a different thought halfway through, and it doesn't really translate to the page. So there was a challenge to try to figure out how to turn these stories into a narrative that would be representative of what I heard. And so sometimes what you hear and sometimes, if you look at a transcript, they don't really match up. So anyway, so I did that. I tried my best, and then I would always send what I put together. I would, try to finish, if somebody started a story over here and they finished it a half an hour later, I'd put them together so that you got the story. And that didn't just tail off into nothing. But what I did was, after I had done that, I always sent them their narrative back to them and asked them to go through it and let me know if I got anything wrong, if this wasn't what they said, this wasn't what they doesn't feel right to them. Did I forget something? Did I mishear something? Whatever. And so I thought that process was really helpful, because it clarified a lot. Things that I thought they meant this, they actually meant something else, and that led to a whole other conversation. And so some players didn't get back to me. Some players said, "Nah, it's fine," and others actually went through a lot of it with me. Mickey Bowers was one who actually went through a lot of it with me, and so that was really helpful. So those are the stories, and like I said, I tried to get a representative sample from different organizations, different hometowns, different, as much as a variety as I could get. Because I very easily, because my first contact was from the Phillies organization, and everybody here knows the reputation that the Phillies had back then, rivaled only by your Red Sox. But it isn't, at the end of the day, this isn't a Red Sox. It's not specific to the Red Sox, and it's not specific to the Phillies. This was happening everywhere. And I thought it was important in the book to really get that across, because I think it could be very easy just to say, this is the Phillies, this is the Red Sox, this is, pick a handful of organizations that got most of the blame for all of this stuff. But it really was happening everywhere, and it was happening in overt ways or covert ways, or ways that maybe even people in the organization didn't even realize, but the people it was affecting did. And one of the players I spoke to, Will Aaron, who was Hank Aaron's cousin. So that's the person who knows somebody. He told me, and he played in the 70s. So he was one of the later players. And he told me about positional segregation, which I had known of a little bit, but he really put it in really stark in human terms when he talked about how he was drafted as a middle infielder, and he was not a big guy. He was 5'8". And if you remember, well, of course you all do, remember middle infielders in the 70s, these are little guys who, a lot of them, they would hit 200. You remember, the parade of mediocre shortstops in the 70s, the Don Kessingers and those guys. No offense to Don Kessinger, Mark Belanger, right? no offense to the Mark Belanger or Don Kessinger fans, but these guys wouldn't sniff the big leagues 20 years later. There's no way these guys would. And every team seemed to have one. There was a few exceptions, but for many years, a middle infielder was a guy who was a good fielder. If he hit 200, he was doing well. And this guy, Will Aaron, was like, well, even he said, I don't think I would ever been a star, but I would have had a chance as a middle infielder. But what happened was they kept pushing him into the outfield. And so, as he said to me, he said, look, as a middle infielder playing in the 70s, I had a chance, not saying I would have made it, but I had a chance. But when you put me in the outfield, I have to compete against guys like Lyman Bostock, guys like Bobby Bonds, guys who have power, guys who are bigger, guys who are stronger. And he said, I can't compete with those guys. And yet all they would do is keep pushing me out there, even though they drafted me as a middle infielder. And so he became very frustrated by that and tried to convince every place he went to put him back in the middle of the infield. But he would succeed for a period of time and then they'd push him back. And he said at one point he got traded. He asked out of the Baltimore organization, because they kept pushing him into the outfield, and he finally was able to convince them to trade him to the Cleveland organization, because they had promised him they would put him in the infield. And he went and he played in the middle of the infield. And then he said I was there for about half a season, and then the farm director came by for one of our games, asked what's that guy doing in the infield, move him to the outfield. And they put him back in the outfield. And he said it was a doubleheader when that guy came. And he said they said I played the first game at second base and I played the second game in center field. And he said between games, I went out behind the back of the stadium, and he said I just sat down and I cried because I knew I had no shot. And the thing that really resonated with me beyond even that was, if Hank Aaron's cousin can't overcome any of this, who has a shot? Nobody has a shot. I would have never thought that a guy who could pick up the phone and talk to Hank Aaron in the mid 70s, who, by the way, at that point was an executive with the Brewers, I believe. I think. And he was even able to reach out to Frank Robinson. He could get into the dugout and talk to Frank Robinson, and Frank Robinson would say, I hear you. There's nothing I can do about it. So it just shows you, I think, or it showed me at least, that the situation was so embedded that you couldn't really overcome it unless you had otherworldly talent. If you had the talent of a Dick Allen or an Ernie Banks or a star quality, at least star quality prospect, you weren't going to make it unless you could succeed at certain positions or, certain things. But otherwise, you really the chips were really stacked against you. So anyway, I thought that was a really resonant story. And the book is full of them. And one guy told me, this was Leroy Reams, is another Philly, but by no means this is a Phillies book. He told me that when I reached out to him, he was very nice, and we talked for a while, and at the end of it, he said, you're the first guy outside of my immediate family who's ever even asked me about any of this stuff. And he, by the way, is on the Reading Phillies. They have a Wall of Fame there. He's on the Wall of Fame. And he said, yeah, they had a ceremony, I don't know how many years ago. He said he went to it. He said, but the problem was, he said, they inducted two guys in the Reading Wall of Fame that year. I was one. The other was Robin Roberts. He says, so he's like, nobody, he says, I was there for the ceremony. He says, but everybody was looking at Robin for, obvious reasons. He said, but nobody, he said, after it was over, I said that there was Philadelphia papers were there and everything like that, but they just wanted to talk to Roberts. They didn't want to talk to him. And really, he had the more compelling story. I mean, Roberts had the better career, but I think that Leroy Reams had the better story, particularly after I got done talking to him, and he talked about how he actually did get called up, and he got one major league at bat, and he talked about that at bat and how he said that was just like heaven that he got up there. And he said it happened to him after. He said he was a prospect for a while, and he had been in the Yankee organization and then the Phillies organization. And he said he was a prospect for a while. He said you can always tell when you're a prospect because they work with you differently. He said you can also tell when you're not a prospect because they start to leave you alone a little bit more. And he said he was a speed guy, and he started to lose his speed, and he wasn't even playing every day, and he thought he had missed his shot. And then the Phillies had some injuries, and out of the blue he gets called up, and he says he can't believe, he thought they made a mistake. They wanted to call somebody else up, and they got the wrong name. But he went up, and he said, he was told, this is, you're here because so and so got hurt, and you'll be here till he's back on the roster. And he said, okay, fine. But he went up there. He said it rained for a week straight. He said I sat in the dugout in the clubhouse for a week straight. It just poured every day. And then when it didn't pour, the field was too wet and they couldn't play. And he said finally they played a game against the Astros. Larry Dierker, he remembers everything about this at bat. And he says, I got up, I pinch hit. Larry Dierker struck me out on 3 pitches, good morning, good afternoon, and good night. And he said, well, I was glad to get up there. He said, but that was I think Dierker struck out 14 or 15 guys that night. And he said after the game, I think Bob Skinner was the manager, called him into the office and said, well, we're sending you back down. And he's like, why? He said, well, you clearly can't hit big league pitching. And he said, well, I only faced one guy. And he's like, yeah, and the guy struck you out on 3 pitches. And he said, well, he struck Dick Allen out 3 times. You're not sending him down. And he's like, well, but we're sending you down. So anyway, they sent him down. He never got back up again. And that was the end. But really, there's a few players in the book who have stories like that, who got up for a week for an at bat. What other person I spoke to was Dick Allen's brother, Ronnie Allen, who was really just a pleasure to talk to. But also he has 1 major league home runs he got for the Cardinals. And he was able to go through every second of that at bat and talk about what it felt like to hit a big league home run and just how incredible it was. Although he also said, I asked him if he was surprised he hit a home run, and he said, no, I wasn't surprised. He said, I hit home runs in the minor league. I knew I could hit home runs. He said, as a matter of fact, a lot of these guys that I faced in the minors hit home runs off, they're in the majors now. He's like, so they were in the majors and I hit home runs off of them in the minors. So I assume I could hit a home run off them in the majors. He said, but the big league game is very different. And he said he could see, and Leroy Reams said the same thing about how he says, it was Leroy Reams who said it. Like he said, it's a good thing I didn't get called up to the big leagues until the end of my career. He says, because if I had gotten called up in the beginning and I saw the difference between my skill set and those players' skill sets, I would have quit right there. Is it because those guys, he said, you don't realize how good they are until you get out there and you can see just how the difference that the different sounds the ball makes when it goes off their bats, when it goes off of your bat. Although Ronnie Allen disagreed. But anyway, so that's what the book is about. I know I've kind of rambled on here about a half an hour and I'll stop. But I just have to say that I found their stories really compelling and heart-wrenching, and also in a way sort of uplifting, because at the end of the day, and the thing that surprised me the most was how all of these guys, they all had a tough time immediately after baseball in terms of dealing with it and dealing with not being in baseball, being released, having a part of their life and failing, how they were treated, feeling they didn't get a fair chance. And a lot of them had a very tough time even watching baseball for many years. But I think pretty much all of them came back to baseball in some form or another, which I thought was really surprising, that they all, as they got older, came back to it and found a way to sort of make some level of peace, if not total, but still find a way to enjoy the game. Because I think the thing that really struck me was that I think one of the guys said this, as awful as the people in the game could be, the game itself was just so great that, and there were so many other facets to it that they loved, that they couldn't help but go back to it at the end, which I thought was really surprising and uplifting, at least to me. So anyway, I think I'll stop there. And if anybody has any questions or anything or comments, happy to talk.
So if you have a question for Mitch Nathanson, go down to the bottom and hit the react button, and you will see a button marked raise hand. Click that button so you can raise your hand and get involved with our Q&A and comment section this evening, and you can talk with Mitch Nathanson. One of the things that I am struck by is thinking about a previous presenter that we had. We had Bob Fitzpatrick in last week, and he was talking about a lot of the same themes. And it sparks a question for me, and it might not be a fair question, and I'm not quite sure how to phrase it correctly. So I'm going to give it a crack by just saying, when you did your research on these players, did you find an underlying theme of why these players were denied, for lack of a better term, their shot at the major leagues? Like, were they all deemed to be hotheads? Were they all deemed to be this or that? Does that question make sense, Mitch?
Yeah, that makes sense. But no, I don't think that was true. I think that was true in Bauer's case. That was his, you can see it in the report.
Yeah.
And there were a few players like that. But mostly it was, I'm trying to think if there's a theme. I think the theme was that they were black. I think that's the theme.
Well, yeah,
That
makes
yeah. Not that they
I guess I'm trying to want a thing that a phrase or something that everyone used as code to deny these guys their rightful shot.
Well, I mean, it depends. It's interesting because it depends on the person you're dealing with and the organization. I spoke to one guy who was in the pilots organization in '69, obviously, and he said that he went to big league spring training in '69. I guess with Boughton, I assume. Although I never asked him about that. But anyway, he went to big league spring training and everything seemed okay. He went for the whole time, and then at the very end of spring training, like, maybe 2 weeks to go, they were playing games already. He said a coach called all the black players in camp into a room and told them flat out, you're just competing against each other. We're going to take 2 of you north. That's it. That we're picking the 2 best, and that those are going, and the rest you're not going. You don't think for a second you're beating out a white guy. We have 2 spots or whatever the number was. It was 1 or 2. I don't know. And that's it. And the guy I was talking to was like, I couldn't believe I had heard that. So there was no code or whatever. There was just, this is how it's going to be. And I think another thing that is, important to keep in mind about this era particularly is the game was technically integrated, right? But the people who are running the farm systems and the people who are the managers or coaches in a lot of these places, those are older guys. Those guys are from the segregated era. Not all of them, obviously, but a lot of them were. And a lot of them carried that with them through. And they had so much power. And the way I don't think it's as hierarchical now as it was, but the way it was, as they explained to me, was your manager, right? If you got on the wrong side of your manager, good night. You were finished. I mean, you weren't going to contradict the manager. And certainly if there was somebody in that chain who refuse to send a good report of you on up, nobody would ever know it. And I did ask a lot of players, like when they would talk to me about incidents that happened with a coach or with somebody in the organization. It was usually a farm director, somebody like that. And I would say, well, did you ever say anything? And the response I almost always got was, oh, you would never say anything, because then you get a reputation of being a complainer. And he said that was the worst thing you could get, was a reputation of being a complainer. And he said, you just, again, more than one player said this, that you didn't say anything. You might have talked to some of your teammates, he said, but even there, you were wary of discussing it with your teammates because you didn't know who they were talking to. And, you know, he said, ultimately, you're, as, you know, Ron Allen said, you know, you get on that team with 25 guys. It's like, well, you're competing with the other 24. Those really aren't your teammates. So you might be friends with some of them, but these guys, you know, are trying to get ahead at your expense. That's what, at least what it looks like.
Mhm.
And so you're not going to say too much to even your best friend on the team, unless you're really sure that person is not going to stab you in the back later, if he's, you know, in a way to make maybe himself look better by comparison. So, and because Ron Allen had some issues merely because his last name was Allen. And he said he felt like there was a bullseye on his back, particularly when he was in the Phillies organization. And I said, do you ever say anything? So I would never say anything. You can't say anything, because if I would say something, the first thing people would say is, look, he's just like his brother. And so he said, so you keep your mouth shut. And he said, but of course, by keeping your mouth shut, it just continues.
Karen Holleran, you're up. Karen, how you doing?
Fine. How are you?
I'm terrific, thanks.
This is very interesting. And I was wondering, do you know the difference between fact and fiction when you're talking and doing these books and these articles?
You mean, like, are they making it up?
Yeah, you know, when you hear about somebody, there's Babe Ruth stories all the time.
Yeah,
Or
right.
you have a Yogi Berra story. Did you run into that?
So whatever I could fact check, I did fact check. You can't fact check anecdotal stories, right? Something that happened in a locker room, good luck. You're not gonna be able to fact check that.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of so what I guess a good way to answer that question, I have a couple answers to that question. It's a good question. So the first thing I would do is I would fact check everything I could fact check, because if that stuff doesn't ring true, then you're going to be a little more suspicious as to the other stuff. Now, does somebody remember if they hit 305 or 311 in 1968? Okay, they get that wrong. I mean, you know, that's one thing. But, you know, they said they played at a certain place at a certain time. I could see who played where in the minor leagues, and I can see that they were there. I can see what happened. If they mentioned people, I could look them up and I could see that they were there, and it would kind of, I could sort of piece together pieces of the puzzle, and then from there, you know, you can decide whether you think the story is truthful or not. But I guess one thing I learned from doing the Boughton book, talking about fact checking all these stories, because Boughton, you know, Boughton will talk and talk and talk and talk, and the thing about Boughton in Ball 4, so the criticism that came, a lot of the criticism that came about Ball 4 was that, well, you know, he didn't interview Bowie Kuhn, and he didn't talk to this other guy to get his story, and this, and how do we know that's true, right? How do we know this happened in the locker room? Because so-and-so says it didn't happen, right? Doug Rader says he never went to the bathroom on a birthday cake. All right, fine. Although I think he does admit he did that. But anyway, so what do you do about that? And I think that where I came down with that eventually was that this was Boughton's story, Ball 4, right? Not my book, but Ball 4. And that was Boughton's story. And it's sort of like a memoir for him. And that's his experience. People can contradict it. And for these stories, it's sort of the same thing. So these are their lived experiences. If somebody comes around later and says, well, that didn't happen, it's like, well, you can tell your story. But the fact that so-and-so says it didn't happen and this person says it did happen doesn't mean it didn't happen. I think there's enough commonalities when I go through all these stories that, you'd have to really, it would be very surprising if everybody made up these stories. So there's in my mind, there is no possibility that any of these things are fictional. Are there, are the members of the people in a room for a given story, might that not be 100% correct? Yeah, perhaps. But I think the stories, I feel very confident that these stories, because they kept repeating, I feel very confident that they were the lived experiences of these people.
Okay, thank you.
Molly, you're next.
Hi, Mitch. Congratulations on your latest work here.
Oh, thanks. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Mitch. One thing that ran through my mind, could you just repeat the name of the first player that you spoke of, Mickey
Bowers.
Mickey Bowers.
Right.
Now, if he had, even at the single A level, if he had bona fides that basically won him the Triple Crown in his league.
Well, not his team, on his team.
On his team. Okay.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it seems like there's legitimate talent there. Did he or any other comparable player with that quality consider, or was it recommended to them to maybe try playing in Japan if there were no real outlets in the United States?
A couple players did play in Japan. One guy I spoke to, Aaron Pointer, whose sisters were the Pointer sisters. He went to Japan. He played in the Colt 45s system and then the Astros. And he went to Japan and he played a few years in Japan. And he said he made, obviously the amount of money he made in Japan set him up for many years afterwards. So he did play in Japan. Other players played in Mexico. They went to Mexico. They would go to the Dominican Republic. And I spoke to them. I spoke to one guy who only played in the Mexican League. And because I thought his stories are really interesting, because he didn't play in the United States, but then he came back and was an agent for Black players in the minor leagues. And so I thought he had a really interesting story, and he talked about comparing what it was like to be in Mexico and playing in the United States. But yeah, again, there was I think playing, a lot of these guys would play all year because that's how they made a living, and B, particularly if you played winter ball and you were a prospect, that's what you wanted to do. So a lot of them had experience. Again, Japan, I think, was just the one guy. But there were other players who went to Japan. There was Mexico, and the Dominican Republic was much more common.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Next up is Molly. Molly, where are you?
Right here.
There she is.
Mitch, thank you for doing this presentation. It's lovely. I was wondering if one of these, of the 13, if one of them was more impactful to you or one was more shocking. Like, did any one of them stand out more to you for any particular reason?
Well, there's a couple. So first, Mickey Bowers, I already talked about him. But there's another guy. So Paul mentioned Triple Crown, and I corrected you and said Triple Crown on his team. But there is a guy, Mo Hill. He did win the Triple Crown in his league, and never got promoted past A-ball. And he almost quit several times. People kept talking him out of it, but one year he won the Triple Crown and he didn't get promoted. He finally went to the I don't know who he went to, farm director, somebody, and asked why, and was told that well, we're not promoting you because this is in Appleton, Wisconsin, and he very few Black people in Appleton, Wisconsin, and the person said to him in the organization, well, we like to keep you here because you're good for the other Black players, so we're not going to promote you. And so he said, but I'm not here for that. I'm here to advance myself. And he won the Triple Crown, and they're still not promoting him, and they're not releasing him, and they're not trading him. And he's like, he stayed there for 8 years in A ball. He never got beyond A ball. And he was finally able to get his release. He was 30, he was 32 years old. And he's like, I'm 32 years old. They finally released me. And they say, go out and, live your dream. And he's like, what am I going to do? I'm 32, I'm done. And so I thought that was pretty impactful.
That's amazing.
So that was, he talked about how he was like, all right, okay, I get it. I'm not going to make it as a ball player, but well, since you're treating me as a coach, why not make me a coach or a manager? And he said they kept promising him to do it. They would never do it. He went to the Kansas City organization in, I think, the early 70s, mid 70s. And when John Schuerholz was there, and he said, John Schuerholz would say all the right things, like we're gonna get you up to the big leagues one way or the other as a coach or whatever. And he said they never did it. They never. Every year it was wait, just be patient. And he said eventually I gave up. He says, how many years are you going to do this? Because you don't make a lot of money. You're not making a pension. You're wasting your youth away on all this. So that was pretty impactful. There's one other guy, Chuck Stone, who played in the Tigers organization, and he ended up later getting involved in the RBI program. I think was John Young the guy who started that? I think that's his name. Yeah, he was friends with him. They both grew up in Los Angeles, and so he grew up with John Young, and John Young started the program, and Chuck Stone got involved in it. Anyway, he ended up getting a job in the front office for the Astros, and this is now we're talking the 21st century. This is now after the Astros went to the World Series in 2005. There was the local NAACP chapter in Houston was picketing outside it was called Minute Maid Park, whatever it was back then, because they didn't have a single African-American player on their roster. And so I think it was Drayton McLean who owned them. He wanted to address it. So I think it was, I don't know, somebody recommended Chuck Stone because, first of all, Chuck Stone knew John Young, and Chuck Stone also is bilingual, and so he can speak Spanish, he can speak English, and he lives in Los Angeles, and he was involved in this program. So they made him an executive with the Tigers, and his job was to find talent that the Astros. His job was to find talent for the Astros to sign. He said, I found a bunch of players, and they put together a team in some sort of league, and he said they wouldn't sign any of them. Now we're talking 2010, so we're talking 14 years ago, and he finally spoke to the regional scouting director for the Astros, the one that, and this is not the main guy, but the regional guy who was in charge of that area, who said to him, I'm never signing a black guy. It's just not going to happen. This is 2010.
Yeah, wow. I was about to say those very words. Wow.
So to anyone who thinks this is like a story from like the distant past, this stuff is still there. And again, this guy is not the owner of the Astros. He's not the, he's probably is a name you probably never heard of. But he said, this is how it goes. He said, and a guy like that, I mentioned earlier about when somebody clogs up the pipeline, there's nothing that you can do. He said, this guy was not going to recommend signing any of the players that he brought to him. And Chuck Stone could only bring players to this guy. That's the chain of command. And he said, this guy wasn't going to sign any of them. He said, so right there, he said that he didn't quit. He said he ended up getting, he complained and then he got fired. And then this guy got fired eventually too. So he's not there, and he hasn't been there for a while. But anyway, yeah, that to me was a really compelling story because that's 14 years ago.
Yeah, that's not that long ago at all.
Right.
Gosh.
Well, thank you very much.
Dixie, you're next, my friend. How you doing?
I'm doing fine.
Good to see you.
I see the kitty is doing fine.
He is. He always is.
Mitch, this sounds like at least your third book. Is it getting easier to do them?
Well, I thought that this one would be easier because it's an oral history. And I really, like I said at the beginning a little bit, I thought that really all I would need to do is just talk to these guys and then get a transcript and then just edit the transcript. Because after doing the Boughton book, there was a lot that was great about it, and Boughton was great, but parts of his family are a nightmare. And to deal with them is just not fun. And I didn't want to do it again. And I had it with that. Again, not Boughton himself. But anyway, so I thought, well, this would be good because I don't have to deal with that dynamic. Instead, these guys will tell me their stories. I'll record them and then I'll fix the transcript. But then I realized that there's a lot of work you got to do. You have to you have to try to figure out how to recreate the feeling, and you can't do that just by printing the words. It's a whole different process, and so that ended up taking a lot of time to figure it out. And then you figure there are ethical issues that go along with that, like what can you do and what can't you do? What's right, what's wrong? Luckily, all these guys, I still had access to them. And so the thing that made me feel better, as I said before, is I would always send it to them. Like, hey, this is what I did. Take a look at this and let me know. And because if I couldn't do that, I don't know what I would have done. Because anybody, I mean, I'm a lawyer and probably some other lawyers in this room, but if you read a deposition transcript, that is not compelling reading. That is boring. So you don't want it to read like a deposition transcript. You want it to be compelling, and not compelling in a fake way, but compelling in the way that, moving in the way that you were moved when you heard the person tell you the story. How do you do that? Because one thing is you hear it through your ears. The other is somebody's reading it with their eyes. That's two different things. They're very different. And to translate one to the other, I'm sure maybe other people were better at this than me, but I found it to be really hard. And I found at the end of the day, this book took a lot of work. So is it getting easier? No, this book was getting harder. Even though it's thinner than Boughton and the Allen book. This book was it was very challenging, but I think it's the most rewarding of all of them, to be quite frank. It's not going to sell as well as Boughton or Allen's book did, not nearly as well. But I think that the whole process was just so much more rewarding. In many ways.
So from start to finish, how long did it take? And what did you tell the publisher in order to get a book published, basically about people who were unknown?
Well, so it took 4 years. The whole process was 4 years. What did I tell them? Well, it was Nebraska and they had done Boughton and Boughton did well. So I think I had a little gravitas there. And so I don't think that if I had gone to them with this book as my first book, they would have been so thrilled. But I think the fact that Boughton did well, I think, is probably the reason this book got published.
Track record counts?
Yeah. I mean, I think they also knew that it wasn't going to sell like that. And I got to admit, it is pretty frustrating because I feel like the stories in here are really compelling stories. And, it's tough. It's outside of SABR. It's tough to get people to engage with this. It is, again, like I said, people told me that, but I have found that to be, 100% true and then some, that people just, is somebody, who do I know? Like, nobody, okay. But it's tough. And it's unfortunate. And as I said, I think this sort of leads to the how this problem perpetuates because, you kind of can forget about it.
Thank you.
But the book shines a beautiful light on men that we never would have heard of otherwise. And I think that is one of the most special parts of the book.
Oh, well, thanks. It's interesting. Like you mentioned, there's a comment there about sending it to ESPN for 30 for 30. That would be great. That's never going to happen. There's no famous people. And you know, another thing that I found really, and again, I'm still like I'm complaining, but not for me, but I think that these guys have stories that people should reach out to them and talk to them and you know, ask them. But people, again, it's hard, you know, because they're not somebody who's famous. But yeah, I think they would be great. Again, not me, them. They would be great. But yeah, it's a tough sell. And I feel for these guys because you know, as I said, the one guy said that really nobody asked him. Other people said, yeah, you know, nobody really cares. You know, if you're famous, people will care, but if you're not famous, yeah, Reggie Jackson. So yeah, Reggie Jackson. That was, you know, interesting that he said that because his story was 100% in line. So I've got the question about whether it's fact or fiction. His story is 100% in line with the stories that I heard. Everything he was saying was exactly what I heard. And he didn't sugarcoat it. And, you know, good for Reggie Jackson because people will listen to Reggie Jackson. And whatever else you think of Reggie Jackson about this or that, he was dead on about that. And you know, good for him. If other people, if people become interested about other people, that would be great too. But if nothing else, at least they heard it from Reggie Jackson. So that's a win.
Reggie Jackson ripped the Band-Aid off at that game. And
Yeah.
I developed a newfound appreciation and respect for Reggie Jackson after hearing him just get after it and say some of the most raw and real things that we've heard in a baseball game or its commentary in an awfully long time. I want to go to Joe Ross, who's got a question for you. Joe, you're up.
Thank you. I think one of the things that I'm just reacting as an editor and a publisher, because that's what I do. First of all, Mitch, I've never met anybody who didn't think their book was perfect before it was edited, and every single time it needed editing. The first thing I thought of about yours, however, is that would make a decent movie, not a book, a movie on the same thing that we've seen. And that you get a star to play one of the roles. And I think you can make a hit out of that.
You're going to take charge of that project?
I'd be happy to look at it. I'm not sure I can get you beyond that, but I'd be happy to look.
It's tough because there's, you know, I think that, you know, when here's the thing about the broadcast of the Rickwood game. I love the Rickwood game. I thought it was great. I thought it was great to watch, and everything was great. I thought Jackson was great. I thought that Joe Davis and John Smoltz were abhorrent, and I thought that because they talked about it, they had this sepia nostalgia about the whole thing, you know, and I'm like, you're missing the whole story. You're just missing the whole story. And I think even John Smoltz at one point during the game was like basically admitted he did no research for this. And I mean, he just basically has to read the stuff that they send him. They do all their research.
Right.
He admitted he didn't care. He didn't do any of it. And I think the problem with that game, although as much as I liked the game and I thought the whole idea was terrific and a lot of great things came out of it, was that if you didn't know anything else, you would just think, oh, they're talking about things that happened all these decades ago, and isn't that horrible, and it's better now, which was what made what Jackson said so compelling, because Jackson really, you know, said, no, let's talk about this. And I thought that was good. But I didn't like the whole sepia approach that the broadcast sort of took once the game started, you know, and it became this other thing, and we could talk about how horrible it was back then, but now it's better. And it's like, well, you know, I got a story in my book that goes to 2010. So, and I'm sure that there are others, and I'm sure that there are ramifications. And one guy, I have to say, who was it? it may have been Will Aaron, but it might be somebody else. Somebody was talking about, the one question I always asked everybody is about baseball today and why they think there are so few Black players today. And a lot of them talked about the legacy of the things that had happened in the past and how it carries over into the present, and how he says anyone who was around in, one guy would say in my era, who had a grandson who could play football and baseball or basketball and baseball, we would always tell them to play the other sport, don't play baseball, because we all went through too much. And football, I can see somebody succeeding, but baseball is just, for many reasons, if you're Black, it's just so much harder to succeed. And then Will Aaron mentioned college baseball and how most of collegiate baseball is white. And, there's less scholarship money. That's true in baseball than there is in football. And most players have partial scholarships. They kind of separate them out among different players. And he said, but, you mean to tell me they can't find University of Southern California or USC can't find Black players to play for them? He says, of course they could if they wanted to, but they don't. And there's financial aid separate from athletic scholarships that many players would qualify for. He says there's not a will to do it. And because there isn't a will to do it, the fact that you have an RBI program, which is great, isn't going to make up for everything else. And so, this goes back to what I was kind of saying before, was like, yeah, these things were in the past, but it all carries through to the present. And if you can't see, if you don't want to see the connection, like I don't think Fox wanted to see the connection, then you won't.
It's a very good point. And I was surprised that there weren't more African-American commentators on that broadcast, especially in play-by-play. That was very interesting to me. I thought the game was fairly well done. I thought that the reverence given to Negro League players that were in attendance that night was exceptional. But I think more could have been done. And I think Fox missed the boat on doing the right thing in a lot of cases during that broadcast. But I want to go to Mark Hoyle because he had a very interesting question in the chat. Mark, you're up. Could you ask that question for us?
Yeah, I didn't know if there was a direct correlation to success at the major league level for teams that kind of push their guys up through it. Like the Cardinals had a lot of African American, the Giants, the Dodgers, all those type teams seem to have success. Did you find stories where they kept guys back too, or then you get a team like Yankees, you see Elston Howard and who else? But
yeah. Well, I mean, different players talk about different organizations. I do remember one player talking about how the Cardinals organization was night and day compared to the Phillies, and how he felt like, and also but also another guy said that he thought the Yankees was pretty good in terms of, well, they were like a corporation. They were more likely to evaluate you on your skills rather than these other things. A lot of teams had, I mean, not just racial, but if in the pre draft era, if you didn't invest a lot in a player, you really had no reason for that guy to go forward. That goes back to the Dick Allen thing, right? The Phillies signed him, I think, for $70,000, $80,000, which was the most anybody had ever signed an amateur for at that point. And so, yeah, they treated him horribly. They didn't care what happened to him in Little Rock, but they had a lot of money invested in him, and therefore they're going to push it. Whereas a guy like Mickey Bowers, again, a little different because he was a drafted player. But the other players, well, I lost my train of thought there. I was reading a comment. But what was I saying? I completely lost my train.
It gets worse as you get older, man.
Well, I started answering that question and I started reading your comment, and then I completely lost my train of thought. Did I answer that question? I don't even remember.
Yeah.
Your question was, if I can remember, was can you talk about the Paul George signing by the Sixers today? And so we can talk about that for half an hour.
Oh boy, here we go. Alex, oh man, Alex Days had some great comments in the chat. I wanted to get him.
Well, let's close off. The Eagles have a John and a Ringo, and the Sixers have Paul and George, so we're good. We got now. Do people know how many MVPs in the 50s were black?
I think a fair number. But I think the
National League 8,
yeah,
American League 0.
And that goes to the point of what a lot of players said to me, which was, if you were black, you would need to be at that level. So the star quality players, they could advance, but if you were not that type of player, remember there's 25 guys on a team, and as again, Will Aaron, go back to him. He's like, look, I knew I wasn't going to be a star, but I could, I thought I could be maybe a utility player in the big leagues, but those jobs didn't go to black players. They went to white players. And so, yeah, so if you look at those, I think Mark Armour did a really good article in a SABR journal several years ago, looking at the racial makeup of MVPs in the 50s and 60s in the NL and AL. I have a recollection of that. Yeah, so if you were that quality, that tier of a player, you could make it. But if you weren't, you got the Mickey Bowers, Will Aaron treatment, I think. And that was true for many years, I think.
True, but I would still say that the Giants would have Cepeda, McCovey, Mays, and the Yankees would have Elston Howard. There was a difference in the leagues. I think the NL was way ahead of the AL. And then just to tie back on Bruce's comment about the announcers, I don't think there's a big pool of black baseball announcers that I don't think there are that are MLB people.
That's a very good point.
Yeah,
and announcers can specialize in any sport.
Yep.
And people know that the incremental dollars are going to the NBA and the NFL because that's where the eyeballs are. So I mean, some of it is the dearth of black players who become announcers, right? That's part of it. But also, generally speaking, baseball is losing the monetary race to those other sports, right? Because they are more global in interest generally, and they're more lucrative. So that relates to the players and the broadcasters, right? Which is not to, in any way minimize the gross disparities that have been discussed this evening that should not exist even today, as noted, within baseball.
Good stuff. Mitch, tell us where we can get this book.
You can get it on Amazon or wherever you get books, I think. Yeah, wherever you go, wherever they have books, they have this one too. So if you go to buy a book, buy this one also.
There you go. There you go. Small bookstores are where it's at, folks. If you have a small local bookstore in your area, drop by there and have them order this book for you. You'll get it just as well as you could from an Amazon or something like that. But this is it, folks. We're going to be taking a very well-deserved summer hiatus. I'm tired. We're going to return Monday, get this, August 19th, with Jerry Griot, who's going to be discussing his new biography of Johnny Mize. But be on the lookout for some announcements of a rather extensive schedule, new chapter offerings, and a lot more. If you're going to SABR 52 in Minneapolis, look me up. I'm going to be there, and I'd love to meet all of you in person. If you're watching this at home, if you're here tonight and you're going to the convention, let me know. We just might be generating some live streams from the convention, so watch your email for announcements on that too. And by the way, for those in the New England area, watch your email for details of an in-person meeting with a very, very special guest, a giant in the field of sports journalism, but no spoilers just yet. Now, finally, before we go, I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight, and I want to thank all of those who are watching at home after the fact on YouTube. If you like what we're doing up here in Northern New England, please subscribe to our channel to get alerts for each of our uploads. And if you're a baseball fan, you need to join SABR, the premier baseball community. Offering an amazing baseball buffet of options to explore your fandom, SABR boasts more than 35 different research communities, over 70 regional chapters, and innumerable opportunities to connect with baseball minds across the world. For more information, go to sabr.org/join today. Mitch Nathanson, this has been fascinating, fun, and a wonderful ride. I want to thank you very much for doing this.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And it was a lot of fun to talk and converse. And I only lost my train of thought one time. So I think that's a win for me.
That's a win. That's a win. And on that win, we're going to get everybody out of here. I appreciate everybody for coming out. We're going to see you at the convention in the middle of August. And after that with Jerry Grio on August 19th. Have a good night, everybody.